And good morning, Bridget. I see Bridget Carty from Lower Susquehanna Heritage Area, Heritage Greenway just joined. And thank you to everyone for attending this morning. So first, some housekeeping things. If you have questions as we go along, please go ahead and enter them into the chat message. We do have all participants muted because sometimes we've had issues with background noise. So please type your questions and we will respond to them as we go along. If it's a question that applies to everyone, I'll try to respond verbally as is relevant. But if it's a question that's more specific to your grant, we may get in contact with you after the webinar or in a private message or email to address that question. And please do, when you have questions, try to select all participants, and so that everyone will be able to see your question when you send it, and that way that'll cut down on the time of us having to read those questions aloud. Everyone will know. So my name, I should have introduced myself already, I feel. My name is Ennis Barbary Smith. I'm the Assistant Administrator for the Maryland Heritage Areas Program. And I'll be co-presenting today with Jen Ruffner, who's the Administrator for the Heritage Areas Program. So we'll be going back and forth. We also have Jen Neely, our Assistant Grants Manager at the Maryland Historical Trust, on the line to help answer questions. And she's the person who you'll be working with on things like your corporate resolution, your grant agreement, some the details of your payments, and we'll get to all that as we go along. And you will be getting a copy of the slideshow after this orientation session, so don't feel that you need to take notes too vigorously as we go along. You'll have all of this, and because we're recording it, we'll even be able to post a recording online as well. So we are going to go straight through all the material today. I think it's about an hour and a half of material, switching back and forth between Jen Ruffner and myself. So if you do need to get up and use the restroom, anything like that, feel free to do that and come back. We won't be taking a break, but you should feel comfortable knowing that you'll have the recording and the slides. So first of all, we just want to congratulate all of you this morning for receiving one of MHAA, one of Maryland Heritage Areas Authority grants. This is a competitive grant program, and we're really happy to support all the projects across the state. We also have some folks who are on the reserve list for the grants attending as well. So if you're on the reserve list, that's a special status. We're still waiting to hear about funding confirmation for you. And if you do have questions about that, contact us at the end or after the webinar. We don't want to get too into that during the webinar itself. But all of these slides will apply to you once your funding has been officially awarded if you're on the reserve list. Today's agenda. So the things that we're going to be going over, first we'll be talking about the grant agreement development timeline. I know many of you are still waiting on those grant agreements. So we'll talk about what the process looks like on our end for that and what you can expect. Then we'll go into legal requirements, and we'll talk about your grant agreement, your corporate resolution, those documents. We will talk about navigating your grant agreement document because it is a larger document and some parts of it are especially important. Then we'll go into more general grantee responsibilities. We'll talk about reporting and requesting disbursements or payments. We'll talk about what we mean by financial documentation. And we do have some changes in our policies this year regarding financial documentation. So make sure to pay attention to that. If you've been a grantee in previous years, this is going to be a bit different this year and hopefully more user-friendly, I want to emphasize. Then we'll go into record keeping and retention, our policy regarding that. As we get to the end, we'll talk about capital project review and review of projects that cause ground disturbance, like archaeology or signage, and special review processes that are in place for that at the Maryland Historical Trust. And then we'll have our question and answer session, of course, at the very end. So why are we here? It's kind of an existential question, but we're here today at the orientation to ensure good stewardship of state funds. So the state of Maryland gets audited too, and we want to make sure that we're in compliance and you all are in compliance with everything that's required as you manage your grants. So the timeline for your grant agreement, which I know you're all looking forward to. You all should have received emails in you all should have received emails in July letting you know that you received your grant or that you're on the reserve list. Then you were asked to fill out a form called a project summary sheet that can be accessed in your online account, the same place where you applied for the grant. And you need to do that in order for us to start the rest of the process of generating your grant agreement. So if you're not sure, or if you know that you haven't done the project summary sheet and submitted that online, please go ahead and do that as soon as possible. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. And then you will get into, so then after you've done your project summary sheet, we can start creating the grant agreement on our end. And it'll be reviewed by the Office of Attorney General. It'll be sent out to you, the grantee, for signature, probably sometime between September and January. So we're giving ourselves a wide range there because we do have a lot of grants to process. And although our funding has increased, our staff levels, we're still waiting to see that increase. So it may take a little longer this year compared with previous years. But please, when you get the grant agreement document sent to you by mail, please make sure to return that promptly, because that is one thing that you'll have control over and one step that we can make sure goes well. So then once you return your signed grant agreement to us, it'll go back to the Office of Attorney General for their signature. It'll go to the Maryland Department of Planning for signature. It will then be a fully executed grant agreement document once it has all those in place. And we'll send you that fully executed grant agreement to your email. So you'll want to be on the lookout for that. And at that point, that's when your payment request for your first payment for the grant will be sent up to the Comptroller of Maryland. And so when you get that fully executed grant agreement document, you're looking at another 45 to 60 days before you see a payment coming in. So it is a slow process, but this is what we have to work with, and we thank you for all your patience in advance. But if you do have something that you need to get started on right away, please talk with us. You can start working on your project as long as you're not waiting on easement review or compliance review or something like that. You can start working on your project after your July award date. You just may not be receiving that payment until later, as you can see from this timeline. So I want to point out that this year we have a new document called the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority Grants Program Grants Manual. And in the manual, we've tried to put everything that you would want to know as you manage your grant. It's available on our website, and we also have sent it to you by email. And we want it to be the one-stop shop for everything related to your grant. So you can have a question, look it up there first, and have that as a resource as you go along. This is our first year doing this, so if you do see areas that we've left out of the manual that you'd like to see included next year, please let us know. And as we go along through the slides today, this next slide is a good example. You can see that we have a little blue circle there in the bottom right-hand screen, and it tells you what page of the manual is referenced using the same subject matter. So the project summary sheet, which we're going to talk about now, is described and talked about on page 4 of your manual. So that way you can sort of go back and forth, maybe not right now during the orientation, but later on when you're digging into the material. So your project summary sheet, I've already mentioned it briefly and mentioned that you do need to submit this to us, even if there are no changes regarding your project. You still need to hit submit online for us to start working on your grant agreement. But what it allows us to do is it allows us to communicate special conditions to you. So in your project summary sheet, there's a field that says special conditions. And that's where you're going to see notes about that you still need to document your match before October 31st, for example, or that you need to have easement review completed or convey a new easement, or have compliance review completed before you start work on the project. So the special conditions field in that project summary sheet is really important. And we'll get into talking more about what things like easement review mean as we go through the slides today, but I just want to note the special conditions field is important. The project summary sheet also allows you to communicate with us by telling us about changes in your timeline, changes in your budget, or changes in the scope of your grant. So when you fill that out, let us know if you are going to be changing anything compared with how you talked about the project in your application. And we want you to be realistic in talking about how long the project is going to take, because when we generate the grant agreement, we can set those dates up front in a realistic way. And of course, the sooner you return this document to us, like other documents when you get them, the sooner we'll be able to get that grant agreement generated. We have a new policy this year regarding indirect costs. So this applies to a specific set of grantees. It applies to nonprofit organizations who are receiving MHAA non-capital grants. So if that's you, listen up to this new policy. We are allowing that for 10% of grant funds in your budget to be used for indirect costs. And what do we mean by indirect costs? We mean operating costs that are for the joint benefit of the grant project and your other organizational activities. So these are things like rent, utilities, salaries, personnel costs, professional service fees. We realize when you take on a grant project, this means you're going to be spending more in these indirect cost areas. And we don't want this new policy to be a barrier in any way to add financial, documentation in any way. So no financial documentation is required for that 10% in your budget. Now, there are some notes about this. You still need to be able to complete your grant project with the funds allocated. You won't be getting an additional 10% of grant funds. You would be moving money from existing line items in your budget to a new indirect costs line item. So you can make these changes and add that indirect costs line either now at the time of the grant agreement development stage, get in contact with your project monitor to start doing that, or if it turns out you come in under budget later on when you're getting ready to close out your grant, then that's another opportunity to say, oh, I could use some of this funding for indirect costs that were associated with the project. Excuse me. So please keep that in mind if you are in those categories of nonprofit and MHAA non-capital grant recipients. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jen Ruffner. One second.
Good morning, everyone. Give us just a minute to transfer the technology. So I want to talk to you today about the actual grant agreement, which is your legal contract with the state. So the important thing to remember is that your grant award is not free money. It does come with terms that you are committing to by signing that grant agreement. So it's really critical that you understand the document in its entirety, that you've read through the whole thing, that you refer to it regularly, and that you are not the only person in your organization who knows what's in that contract, because anyone working on your project needs to know what you have committed to by entering into this agreement with the state. So make sure when that comes in the mail, you read through it. Absolutely, if you have questions on the contents of it, give us a call. We're happy to answer any questions you may have. And then make sure that you have someone who is legally authorized for your organization to enter into contracts, sign the document. And if you're not sure about that, you may want to check your bylaws. That often spells out who is allowed to enter into contracts for your organization, but it does need to be someone who's legally authorized to do that. And one of the ways that we know at the state who is legally authorized to do that is through the corporate resolution, which is a document that you'll need to submit as well. Now keep in mind, if you've received a grant from us within the last 3 years, this document is good for 3 years, so you may not need to do it this year, but if you're new to our grant program or you haven't had a grant with us for several years, you will need to complete the corporate resolution, which you'll receive with your grant agreement if you are a nonprofit organization. Government entities, you can disregard this as this does not apply to you. So this document is basically certifying that the board has met and they are agreeing to enter into the grant and they agree to the clauses that are spelled out in the corporate resolution. And it also allows certification of the signatories who are allowed to sign contracts. So you're going to fill out the form, and then there's a section for signatures. So you need at least 2 people to sign that document where it's asking for the authorized signatories. And then your secretary or another officer needs to certify those signatures. So there's a number of different signatures that happen, but you need to make sure you have all of them on there. And it can be more than 2 people who are authorized to sign for your organization, so you can have as many as you need. But there is a minimum of 2, and the secretary would be a third, the secretary or the officer that's going to sign that. And you need to make sure that whoever is signing the corporate resolution has to be the same person that's signing the grant agreement. Whoever's a signatory on the corporate resolution must be one of the person who's signing the grant agreement, but it should not be the secretary. The secretary is certifying the signatories. So it sounds complicated. If you have questions with this, please give us a call. Contact Jen Neely. She can answer those questions. But the good news is that you only need to do this once every 3 years. But it is important, and we can't move forward with processing your grant agreement without that document. Some additional things to know about the legal requirements. You must be in good standing with the State Department of Assessment and Taxation. If you are not, we can't execute the grant agreement. We can't issue payments. But it is something that is generally an easy fix, so we encourage you to check this online regularly because this is something that can change from day to day. The website is there, and we will, after this webinar, provide you with a little handout that says what to do if you're not in good standing. Usually it's an easy fix, but it is something that you need to take care of. We cannot resolve that for you. You need to work with SDAT directly. One point in time that's really good to check this is right around the tax deadline in April. We find that a number of nonprofits fail to submit the form stating that they don't need to pay property tax and then end up in not good standing because of that. So every year about that time, we find that a lot of people slip into not good standing. It's an easy fix. There's an online form. You can resolve it quickly, but it does take some time for that status update to show up on the website, and until we see it on the website, we can't move forward. Another reason that it's really good to keep an eye on your status is that when you are requesting payments from us, if you owe the state money in taxes, they can recapture that from your grant payout, from your payment that you're going to receive from the grant. So you risk us issuing a payment that then immediately goes back to the comptroller. And again, that's something that we don't control, but it's important to check. So you would want to check that when you go to submit a request for disbursement or submit a report. So if you haven't checked yours lately, I encourage you to do that today. So when you get your grant agreement, obviously you want to read the whole thing and read it thoroughly, but the 2 sections that are going to be most critical are Exhibits A and B. The main body of the grant agreement is boilerplate that is essentially the same for every grantee, and it has a lot of important information in there. But Exhibits A and B are your project-specific requirements. So it has the scope of work, which is what you need to do, your timetable, which is the grant period when you can be incurring expenses for the grant. It has any special conditions that you may need to abide by. This particularly applies to capital projects. It shows how much money you need to contribute to the project, what your disbursement schedule is, any reporting schedules, and Exhibit B is your budget. So this section of your grant agreement, I always encourage folks to make a copy it on fluorescent pink paper if you need to, put it on your bulletin board, hand it out to anyone who's working on your project, because this you should be referring to frequently, because you need to make sure that you are moving forward with your project within the terms that are spelled out in your grant agreement. And this is the easiest way to do that, is to reference these two exhibits. So when you're doing a grant project, you need to make sure that the work that you want to do is within the approved scope, that the expenditures that you plan to incur are within the approved budget, and you need to make sure that the work will take place within your approved grant period. So we've made this great little flow chart to help you determine if a particular element of your project is eligible to be included within the grant. And this is another handout that we will provide to you after the workshop, the webinar. So you can keep this on your bulletin board with your fluorescent pink Exhibits A and B. So if you're ever in doubt, you can check this. So if the work is within the scope and if it is happening within the grant period, you can do it. If it's within the budget and it's within the grant period, you can go ahead and do it. If it is not in the budget or the scope, or if your project completion date has passed, then you can't do the work without having a conversation with your project monitor. You need to check in. You may need to get an amendment. You may need to revise your budget. You may need to get an extension to complete your work. So if you're ever in doubt, please shoot us an email, give us a call. We would rather have a quick conversation with you to find out if something that you're planning to include in the project is eligible or not before you've actually done the work. Because if you would go ahead and do it, and then we find out that it actually isn't eligible and can't be included in the project, that leaves you on the hook for those expenditures, and you may not be able to be reimbursed with the grant or count it as your match. And that could put you in trouble with your overall project and your overall budget. So when in doubt, check with us. But as a starting point, pull out this little flow chart and check and see if it's something that you can include in your project. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ennis, and she will take it from there.
All right. Yes, thank you, Jen. And we're going to continue talking a little bit about amendments and the items in your grant agreement that you need to be aware of and be checking on if you're thinking about, do I need an amendment? Do I need an extension for my project? So first, the timetable. This is, again, an element that's in your grant agreement. And let's look at the terminology that's used here. So one thing that's going to be specific in your timetable is the project start date or the project commencement date. We sometimes refer to it as. For everyone who was awarded a grant in this cycle, your project start date is July 11th, 2019. Even if you're not going to be starting work on your project right away, that's the legal project start date for us. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't be able to give you an extension, anything like that. It's just that's the date we're going to be using as your project start date for everyone. The next thing that you'll see in your timetable in your grant agreement is a mid-project report due date. Oh, I forgot to say, let me go back to the project start date for a moment. This start date, this is the date when you can start incurring expenditures for your grant project and you can start the work unless your project needs an easement review or compliance review, which we'll get into more. So unless you're in that category, which you would see under your special conditions field in the project summary sheet, you can start doing the work after July 11th. Now, the project mid-project report due date. This is basically just a progress report. It's about halfway through your project, and at that point we want you to log in, give it into your online account and submit a form giving us an update on how your project is going and possibly getting a payment at that time. The next date to be aware of, and this is the one we have in red because it's very important to remember, is the project completion date. So this is the date by which all the funds for your grant, both match and grant funds, need to be expended. All the work on the project needs to be complete, and this is your last chance to request an extension for the project. So please, put this date in red on your calendar, maybe set an alert a month ahead of time, letting you know it's coming up, because you do want to make sure to request an extension before this date if that's needed. Finally, the final report due date, that'll be about 2 months after your project completion date. So that gives you some time between the completing the work and actually being able to report on and share everything in your final report. The next thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about, all right, do I need to request an amendment, is you want to look at your budget that's in your grant agreement. And I do want to emphasize that you should be looking at the budget that's specifically in your grant agreement or in your latest amendment letter if you have already had a budget amendment. Because sometimes people will look at the budget in their application, and sometimes that's a little bit different. We combine line items, we simplify sometimes in your grant agreement budget, so please look at that budget, which is the official one. Now, looking at that budget, you may spend more or less on line items without requesting an amendment. So as long as your spending is changing and it's just like, all right, this expenditure turned out to be a little bit more than I thought, this one was a bit less, as long as you're just changing amounts between line items, you don't need to request a budget amendment with us, your project monitors. But if you'd like to completely get rid of a line item that you didn't have to do any spending on, or you'd like to add a new line item because there's a new component in your project that has become important, then you must request an amendment to do that. And this is a change from previous years, so keep that in mind that you can move amounts between existing line items, and there's not a specific limit on that amount. Now we have an example here. So this is a made-up example of the most wonderful exhibit, project budget, and you can see that the exhibit research consultant is going to be charging $10,000 total between grant funds and cash match. And I have a question there at the bottom of the screen for you all. You can answer this to all participants, please. If exhibit research comes to $9,300, so down from $10,000 total, and all other line items are coming in on target, that their spending is pretty much the same, so you have this extra $700, and your board wants to spend that extra $700 on an exhibit opening reception. Do you need to ask for a budget amendment in this case? And if you'd like to answer in the chat window, I'd encourage you to. If not, that's okay too. Oh, yes, I see. Yep. So yes, you do need to request a budget amendment. And I'm seeing all kinds of yeses. Now there is one question. The question says, is rebudgeting without prior approval okay between grant funds and cash match allowable as well? Yes. So as long as it's an existing line item in your budget, you can move the amounts around. Now, there are some things we're going to get into that can only be match and that can only be funded by grant funds. So I would still encourage you, if you're moving something from match to grant funds, if you're considering that, or from grant funds to match, talk to your project monitor about that first, because there may be cases when you're moving something that can't count as match. Even in this example, or that we'd want to count as match rather than grant funds. Even in this example, we probably would say an opening reception, that's related to the exhibit, but it's not really part of the exhibit itself. We probably encourage you to put that in the match category when we added it. So thank you all for answering that, and good questions. So amendments in general, this is what they allow you to do, to sum up. They allow you to extend the time allotted to complete your project, to allow for adjustments to your scope of work, small adjustments, and to allow for adjustments to your budget, adding or subtracting line items. Now, if you do want to reallocate funds and it's a much larger change, then sometimes we need to take your request to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority and have them review it. So many of them we can approve at the staff level, but sometimes we do need to take that to the authority. And I'm seeing a question coming in. So where does the indirect costs fit into the budget? Those, if you're a nonprofit and you have a non-capital grant, you do have the opportunity again to add those indirect costs into your budget, but you would need to either do a budget amendment or talk to us right now to add that as a line item, and that would be funded by the grant. So if that's something you're considering, we can talk to you a bit about that afterwards. And then we're getting another question about staff time. So that one I'm going to table for a minute because we are going to get into that topic here in just a few minutes. So that's what we summed up, that this is what an amendment will allow you to do. How do you request an amendment? Well, you just need to email your project monitor and request that amendment, explaining why you need it, including a proposed updated budget, if that's what you're asking for, an updated timetable, if that's the ask, or an updated scope. And you want to include some basic information about your grant, like the fiscal year, the project title, everything like that. And you can see a full list of what should be included in your request on page 20 in your manuals. What if you get to the end and there's money left over? First of all, good job, well done on being a good steward of state funds and making sure everything is reasonable in cost. The first thing that we would encourage you to ask yourselves and talk with your project monitor about is there anything else that needs to be done on the project that's related to the project or very closely related to the project? Or have you already, if you're in a position to do so, have you already taken advantage of adding those indirect costs into your budget? So those are two things we would suggest. We don't want to lower the award of your grant, although that's an option. We would like for you to be able to spend the money on something that's related and that's useful for your organization. But please make this request before your project completion date in order to add any additional line items to the budget, because that will be very important in whether we can approve it or not. And just don't spend and ask for approval later. Then in that case, you may end up with a reduced grant award, which none of us want to see. So there are some things that your grant and match, they just will not cover. We're not allowed to have them cover. That's anything that's not in your budget, for one thing. And if you're a government grantee, or if you have received a capital grant, your grant and match will not cover indirect costs or overhead for your organization. Another thing we can't cover is alcohol. So if you're having like a reception or something like that, the alcohol would not be included in either grant or match. There are some things that can be match funded, but they just can't be directly funded by your grant. And so that includes project marketing and staff salaries for time spent on the project. Um, and so my note about staff salaries here is staff salaries, that might also be something you're including in the indirect costs line item if you're eligible to do that. So if you're doing that, make sure that the staff salary portion, if you're also including that as part of your match, that you're not double counting those hours. You want to make sure those are separate hours. Yeah, just don't double count. That would not be good. All right, and I think we've got the question answered about that. So, more on your match. And I think many of you learned this as you were in the process of applying for the grant. So this is just a review about the requirements associated with match. All matching funds must be spent on items that are directly related to the grant project. So if your grant project is the restoration of a building, you can't be spending your match funds on something like a fundraiser or something like that. And all match, that's in your budget. So you will already know what your match needs to be spent on because it's included in your grant budget. All match also must be spent within the time frame of the grant, so that means after your project start date, July 11th, 2019, and before your project completion date. And for every dollar of state funds, you're providing a dollar of your funds for support. 75% of that can be cash match, while up to 25% can be in-kind match. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the distinction between those two because I know some grant programs do that differently. The approved match expenditures, again, are listed in your budget. So if what you want to spend your match on changes, you do need to ask for approval through a budget amendment because you'd be adding or subtracting a line item. However, the source of your match can change. It may change. You just can't use state funding as your match. So if you had applied for a private grant or a federal grant and you thought that was going to be your match and it ends up that you are not able to use that as your match and you have to dig into your operational funding, for example, or funding reserves, all that's fine. You don't need to let us know. Just do not use other state funds as match. That's the only requirement there. And getting into the difference between cash match and in-kind match. So cash match for us includes any cash purchases or expenditures, so money that you're spending on the project for materials, for contractors. It also can include staff salaries of the applicant organization for work that's directly related to the project. So you can't include the whole salary of, say, your assistant director at the organization just because he or she's working on the project on and off. You'll need to track the hours and include the staff salary for just for the work that's done related to the project. It's the same with in-kind match. So in-kind match includes volunteer time. It includes staff time from other organizations, and the same thing applies for work directly related to the grant project. In-kind match can also include donated professional services or discounts and donated materials. So if you're getting any of these services or materials donated, you need to make sure that's documented through an invoice, for example, showing that discount or donation is happening. And you'll also be required to report on other project costs when you fill out your reports. So other project costs will be anything that your organization is spending on the project that's above and beyond what's required of your match. And we do want you to make sure to include those when you do your reporting because that will allow us to one, see how much the project costs, and then we'll total, and we'll be able to give advice to others based on that, knowing how much you've actually spent on your project. And two, it will allow us to show leverage numbers for things like economic impact reports, where we can say for every dollar of state funds, look at all the funding and all the economic activity that's being generated. Some more details on recording volunteer hours for the project. You do need to keep a log of volunteer hours as you go along. Please include the who, what, when, how long when you do that. You can either have the volunteers fill out individual timesheets, or you can keep an overall spreadsheet of all the volunteer hours. And either way, you'll want the volunteers to sign off on their individual timesheets, or to have a volunteer manager or a volunteer who's serving as the volunteer manager sign off on the hours they're entering into the spreadsheet. And then you can multiply those hours by the rate for Maryland, which, as you can see, we check the rate on independentsector.org, and right now for Maryland that rate is $28.65. If you go to fill out your final report and you check back and it turns out they've updated the rate and now they have a rate for 2019, please use that rate when you submit your report. All right, so getting into the question of procurement. So how you all as grantees are required to select vendors and to work with them. The following procurement procedures should be followed. So if you're a government organization, just follow your established procedures that you should already have in place. We trust you to do that. For nonprofit organizations, we do have some specific guidelines that are listed in the manual, and that I'll go over here now as well. So if you're a nonprofit and you have a single expenditure in your budget, this is going to be like one check you're going to write, one credit card payment you're going to make, a single expenditure that's between $500 and $10,000, you're required to get at least 2 written bids from vendors. And this is all about making sure you're just getting a reasonable price. If you have a single expenditure that is above $10,000, $10,000 or over, then you're required to get written bids from at least 3 different vendors. Now, you're not required to take the lowest bid. We want you to select the select the vendor, select the contractor who's going to do the best work for your project, but you should document the criteria that you used to make that choice. I've also talked with some of you about sole source procurement. So that's also an option if you know that you need to work with a specific vendor already or a specific consultant because they have special expertise, or they're the only one in your region, etc. Sole source procurement is also an option, but you need to make sure you're documenting that with like an internal memo, for example. If you are receiving an MHAA capital grant that is $90,000 or greater, then you must complete a form called a Minority Business Enterprise Plan. This is a form that will come to you with your grant agreement, so that's when you'll have the opportunity to fill it out. And you'll be setting a goal for your organization for this project. It's not a predetermined goal, but you'll be setting a goal of the percentage of the work in this grant project that you'd like to see go to a minority business enterprise. And if it's not feasible for your project, then you can talk to your project monitor about the circumstances. It's possible you might be eligible for a waiver of this requirement, but in general, you should set a goal, give it some thought, and try to meet that goal. Make a best effort. You will not be penalized in any way if you do not meet the goal, however. All right. So, some other requirements that you're going to see in your grant agreement and that you should pay attention to. One is that you must be sending drafts to MHAA staff for review. So your project monitor will usually be the person who you'd send that request to. And these are things like interpretive signs, brochures, reports, advertisements, anything that is public facing. We would like to review, and actually you're required as the part of the terms of your grant agreement to send those to us for review. Please give us a couple weeks if possible. Usually we can approve those fairly quickly, but it would be nice to have some time to review. And you also need to acknowledge MHAA's support on all of your grant products. This will mean including our logo, which we can send you a high-resolution version of when you're ready to use it, and also including a statement, the statement that's on the other side to the right there of the logo. So this is the general statement that you're required to include. However, if you're working on a product where you really don't have enough space to include this entire statement, or it doesn't make sense to include the logo because it's a radio ad or something like that, then please talk with your project monitor and we can help to figure out what's the best way for you to acknowledge our support. And don't forget to include your local heritage area's logo as well. They are integral in this process as well and need to be acknowledged. So we've covered a lot of grantee responsibilities. So, and I want to take this point to just sum up all those responsibilities. You're required to keep to the timetable, keep to the budget, keep to the scope as set out in your grant agreement. Document all the expenditures you're making, both in terms of grant funds and matching contribution. Ask MHAA to review drafts and make sure to acknowledge MHAA support. And stay in compliance with the State Department of Assessments and Taxation with SDAT to make sure that you can actually get your payments when you request one. And so basically we're just saying we want you to be able to finish the project as described, do what you said you were going to do, and stay in communication with us along the way. The communication part is pretty much the most important part. If you have a question, feel free to reach out to us. We encourage that. And we've made it halfway through, so thank you all for sticking with us. We are going to continue. We're not taking a break here, but just wanted to let you know you've made it about halfway. So now we're going to switch to and continue with the topic of reporting and documentation. So when you get ready to do that mid-project report, for example, all the reports are submitted online. We do not accept mailed reports. So in order to access your reports, you go to My Grant Account on MHT's website, mht.maryland.gov. And we have it circled there on the slide. It's the same portal that you used when you applied for the grant. And so you'll want to log in using the same credentials that you did when you created the grant application. However, if you've forgotten your password, there is a forgot password option that you can click on, and it'll help you reset your password with a temporary one. And if you have any trouble with that, just contact us, of course, and we're happy to try to help. When you get into the report form itself, you just need to answer the questions on the form and upload the documents as required. And again, make sure that you're referring to the version of the budget that appears in your grant agreement or in your most recent budget amendment letter, if you've had a budget amendment. So once you log in, you'll see a screen like this, and you will see requirements, the requirements tab circled there at the top. is where you'll want to go in order to see your reports. You may also need to change the option on the right, see where it says Show, and it lists new requirements, so you can change that to in progress requirements or submitted requirements. And if you're not seeing the report that you'd like to access when you first go into requirements, I would try changing that and looking under all those different tabs. As you go through the report, you will have the opportunity to upload attachments. We love when you upload things like photographs of the work, reports, deliverables that are uploadable. If you run out of space and it won't allow you to upload those deliverables, let your project monitor know, and we can either accept them by email or by a Dropbox or something like that if they're large files. But try to upload them all there. And as you go through the form, you'll just click Next as you go along until you see an option to click Review. When you click Review, it'll let you know if you've missed anything on the form and if you have to correct anything. It'll give you an opportunity to update those fields that you may have missed. And then you'll finally see the Submit button after that. And then you'll have an opportunity to submit it. Please make sure that you have answered everything in its entirety and that you've uploaded everything you need to before you hit that Submit. All right, and I think at this point I'm going to turn it back over to Jen Ruffner for a portion of the presentation. And give us just 1 minute as I change her role to presenter here. Okay.
So, of course, one of the most critical questions you probably have is when are you going to get your money? Because that's what this grant is all about, is making sure that you have funds to do the project that you're about to undertake. Typically, we provide 3 payments that are scheduled in your grant agreement. The first is the easiest. All we need to do is have a signed and executed grant agreement and a signed corporate resolution if that applies, and then we will issue the first 25% of your project up front. So you don't need to fill out an additional form. It will just come once we've got all of the other signatures in place. Your second and third payments will be issued when you submit and have approval for the reports that Ennis was just talking about. So there's a mid-project report and a final report. You will also need to complete a certification of expenses form, which we will talk about in a few slides. So for your second payment, you've gotten 25% up front. At the midpoint of your project, which will be spelled out in your grant agreement, you may request up to 50% of your grant award. What we need to see in order for you to receive that 50% is a completed mid-project report, a completed certification of expenses form certifying that you have incurred expenses to date, and we want to see that you are making progress on the project. So if you haven't done anything at the midpoint, you will not be eligible to get your 50%. But if you are making progress, you've incurred approximately half of your total project costs, then we can move forward with that 50% payment. And that is at the discretion of your project monitor. And we obviously understand that some projects are going to be front-loaded, some projects are going to be back-loaded. It all depends on the timing of when your different project activities take place. So if you're concerned about that piece, make sure you're talking to your project monitor, and we'll make sure that you have the funds when you need them. Your final payment is always going to be a reimbursable payment. This will be issued after your project completion date. We will need to see a completed final report form. We will need evidence that you have completed all of the required elements of your project, and we will need a completed certification of expenses form. In some cases, you will also be required to submit financial documentation. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But we need all of these materials. But that means in order to be able to submit proof that you've expended all the funds, proof that your work is done, this cannot happen until your project is complete. So you need to make sure that you've expended all those funds by the project completion date, that you have completed the project, that you've submitted all of the required paperwork, and only then will we issue that final payment, which will be 25%, or if you weren't able to expend all the funds, whatever your remaining balance is. So keep that in mind, that that last 25% will always be reimbursable, and plan accordingly. So when can you expect to get your funds? As I said, that first 25% doesn't require any additional payment, so the sooner you get that signed grant agreement back to us and we get it processed with all the necessary signatures, the sooner we'll get you that initial payment. We roughly say about 60 days from the execution of the grant agreement, and that means when everybody has signed it. So that means you've signed it, the Department of Planning has signed it, our Office of Attorney General folks have signed it. At that point, probably about 60 days. The second, again, will come once you've submitted that mid-project report and all of the associated documentation. And the final will come once you've demonstrated you have completed the project. In all of these cases, and particularly the second and third payments, there will be some time that's required for your project monitor to review the materials that you've submitted, for our grant staff to then process the payment, and for it then to go to the comptroller to actually issue the payment. So we ask that you are patient. We do try and keep these things moving, but again, as Ennis noted, due to the workload of our increased grant numbers, this is not as speedy a process as we would like, and it does take us some time to review those materials. But we do try and keep them moving, so we generally say hopefully within 45 to 60 days you'll have your payment. If you are on a tight schedule, please don't hesitate to reach out to your project monitor and we'll see what we can do to speed up the process. But keep in mind that once it goes to the comptroller, it is out of our control and we cannot speed up the process at that point. So make sure that you're submitting your materials in a timely fashion so that we can get them back to you as soon as we are able. And again, that final payment is a reimbursable payment. And don't forget, when you are submitting requests for funds, to check your SDAT status, because we don't want you to have funds recaptured. Another way to speed up the process is to make sure that you are signed up for direct deposit. If you've had previous grants and you're already signed up, you're good to go. But if you have not signed up and you're still getting paper checks and want to expedite the process, you can call this number. We've just checked recently. It is option number 7 on the phone menu. And you can get set up for direct deposit, and that does help speed things up because you're not waiting for a check to arrive in the mail. So we strongly encourage you to do that if you have not already done so. Now, those of you who've been with us before will notice that I've been talking about a few new things. I've been talking about a certification of expenses form, and I've been talking about spot checking. So we this year are implementing a new financial documentation policy. The core of this policy is that while everyone is required to retain financial documentation of your grant and match expenditures, only a portion of you will actually need to submit that documentation with your final report. We will be doing a process of spot checking rather than requiring everyone to submit all their paperwork. Now, that is not to say that you should not be retaining this paperwork, because you will not know if you're selected for spot check up front, and you could be audited at any point in the future. So, how are we going to do this? If you are requesting a disbursement, you will need to fill out the new certification of expenses form. And you can think of this as similar to doing your taxes. You're going to fill out a form that shows all of the expenditures that have been incurred to date. You do not need to send us documentation unless you're selected for spot check, and you will be signing that form certifying that it is accurate, just like your taxes. And just like your taxes, you will be retaining the paperwork that backs up what is on that form, but we don't need you to send it to us unless we ask you to at a later date. Please, when you're filling out this form, and I've got one on the next couple slides, when you fill this out, please make sure that you are actually signing the form. So you'll need to fill it out, print it, sign it with a pen, and then scan it and then upload it back into the system. Please do not type your name, even if you're using a fancy script font that looks like a signature. We need it to actually be a pen on paper signature that then gets scanned and uploaded, because what you're doing is you are legally signing that you are certifying the accuracy of the information on that form. So let's take a look at this form, and I'm actually just going to show you the form. So those of you who filled out our request for disbursement forms will note that this looks very similar but more simplified. We heard you, and this whole new financial policy is an effort to make things more streamlined and less of a burden for you, the grantee. But please, when you are filling out these new forms, if you have any concerns, please let us know and we will work to improve them as we move along. So you will put your contact information and your grant information at the top. The first column, which says use of funds, this should match either the budget in Exhibit B of your grant agreement, which was your original approved budget, or if you have received an amendment, if you needed to add or remove line items and you have an amendment letter stating that you have amended the budget, then you would use that budget. But these line items should match what is in that approved budget, whether it's in the grant agreement or your most recent amendment letter. It should not be the budget that was in your grant application, because when you get your grant agreement, you will note that there are changes. We try and consolidate line items. We try and make it a more streamlined budget, again, so that there is less documentation and it's easier for you to make changes. So make sure that you've got those use of funds matching your approved budget. The grant funds and grantee required contribution incurred to date, this is just as it sounds. It's what you have incurred under both the match expenses and the grantee's contribution at that point in time. It doesn't mean that the work is complete. It doesn't mean that you've paid for those expenses, but if you have incurred them, you've signed a contract, you've received an invoice, they go on this sheet. And this basically is giving us a snapshot of where you are in the process of your grant project. So in this example, this project is doing brochure design and wayside panel production. And you can see that they've been doing expenditures on the brochure and printing, and I believe they're actually finished. We'll give you a sample Exhibit A and B that you can cross-reference when you go back and review these materials. But they've only done part of their wayside panel design, and you can see they haven't even started the production. But they have spent approximately half of their grant funds and half of the total project cost, so about $23,000. So they would get their full $12,000 payment on this example. Oh, and I'm reminded by Ennis that you did receive this example yesterday. So if you want to follow along, you can take a look. But essentially, you're not saying that the project's done. You're not saying that any given line item is done, but you are showing that you have incurred expenses and you are moving forward with the project. What we don't want to see is a certification of expenses form where you haven't expended any funds, you haven't incurred any funds, and it's all zeros. That tells us that you haven't even started yet, and we don't want to issue a payment until we know that you're well underway at this point. So keep that in mind, and again, remember that you've got that real signature at the bottom. We do need to have that. You can just sign it and upload it. Even if you have a scanned version of your signature that you put in there, that's okay too, but it cannot just be a typed name. So, what happens if you are selected for spot check? In the past, everyone needed to submit their financial documentation. Moving forward, you will be notified around the time of your project completion date whether or not you've been selected for spot check. And that will give you approximately 2 months to pull together your documentation and submit it with your final report. Now, that said, as I said earlier, you are still required to retain all of the documentation, and it is much easier if you don't have to recreate it at the end. So I would not recommend playing chicken with the spot check process, and just have your paperwork ready, have it pulled together, and that way if you get the notification that you've been selected, you're ready to go and can upload it with your final report. So you will submit that material. If you're missing anything, your project monitor will follow up with you and let you know. But keep in mind that if you are not able to provide the documentation at this point, you risk having your grant funds recaptured, and we certainly don't want to see that. So make sure that you are retaining those materials and have them ready to go if you're selected for spot check. So what is financial documentation? You must retain documentation of expenditure. So invoices, receipts, signed contracts, staff time logs, pay stubs, volunteer time logs, anything that shows that you are incurring these expenditures. We also encourage you to keep canceled checks and credit card statements, that proof of payment, as a standard accounting practice, but you will not be required to submit those as part of your financial spot check if you are selected. But again, it is good practice to hang on to those. Please make sure that the expenditures align with the final approved budget, whether it's in your grant agreement or in your most recent amendment letter. And you will need to upload that documentation, that proof of expenditure, if you are selected for spot check. So if you're selected for spot check, and just as good practice because you don't know if you'll need to submit it or not, please make sure that you are making it clear how the invoices and receipts link to the budget. If you don't, it makes it very difficult for us to review on our end because we can't tell how they align with the approved line items in your budget. Please don't include documentation that doesn't relate to the current project. Look out for math errors. Make sure that you have that documentation for all expenditures. And please don't only include QuickBook or accounting software printouts as your documentation. That is not acceptable documentation unless you are a government entity, in which case your official government accounting system printout is okay. And I will note that having those QuickBook or accounting software printouts is a great way to help us sort of figure out how your expenditures align with the budget, so you may include those, but keep in mind that unless you're a government entity, you will need to have additional documentation that goes along with that. Things that we do want to see if you're selected for spot check: proof of expenditure that is labeled by budget category and line item. You'll notice on the certification of expenses form that we have numbered line items. Write those numbers on the invoices and contracts so that we can figure out which line item each piece of paper aligns with. Make sure that you include those timesheets for your volunteer and staff time so that we can see that portion of your match. Make sure that the documentation matches the line items. Don't make us try and figure out if a particular invoice covers 2 or 3 different line items. Break it out and tell us how much of that invoice goes to each line item, because we are going to have to recreate how you've put together this packet of material. And you want to make it as easy as possible for us to do that. So if you're selected, you will need to do all of these things. But again, it's good practice to do this because you will not know until the end of your project if you will need to submit that documentation. So even if you're not selected for spot check, you will be required to retain your records. You will need to keep your timesheets, your proof of expenditure for both grant funds and matching funds, and you must keep those for 5 years from the project completion date. And this is because our books get audited, and that audit could extend to your grant records associated with this project. So you do need to retain all of those, even if you are not selected for the spot check and don't submit them as part of your final report. And I am going to turn it back to Ennis for the final home stretch.
Yes, thank you, Jen. And exciting changes to our financial documentation policy. So the next couple slides are referring specifically to review of MHAA capital projects and let's see, and also projects that are non-capital projects but that involve ground disturbance. So things like archaeology or signage installation projects. If you know that this doesn't apply to you and you don't feel like you have any other questions that you need to talk with us about right now, feel free to jump off the webinar at this point. But if not, please stay engaged if this does apply to you. Just trying to change my role back to presenter. Let's see. Oh, I think I am the presenter already. Okay. So another thing to note here on this slide, before we change slides actually, is you will see the requirements that apply to you in the special conditions field on your project summary sheet. So that is where you can go and look and see, okay, am I required to convey an easement? Does my project need easement review? Does my project need compliance review? In many of these cases, and it will say so in the special conditions, you're not permitted to even begin the work on the structure, on the building, on the land that you're dealing with until your project, until you've met those conditions. So first of all, some background information about compliance review. All projects that are receiving Maryland state funding of any type must be reviewed to assess their effect on National Register of Historic Places properties and National Register eligible historic properties as well. So that's the Maryland state law that we're staying in compliance with. The compliance team, pictured here, we have a lot to thank them for this year because they actually reviewed all of your projects before you even knew that you were awarded a grant. So they've really gotten ahead of that this year, and they've reviewed all of them. Their job in doing that is to identify historic properties that are potentially affected and to assess whether your project is going to have any effects on those properties. If it is, they want to help you find ways to avoid or minimize or mitigate those adverse effects. And if they needed more information or anything like that, you would have seen that in your special conditions field in your project summary sheet. So there's a couple different scenarios you may have seen related to compliance when you look at your special conditions field. One, nothing's listed in your special conditions field. Well, that means that MHT's compliance team does not need any additional information about your project at this time, and you can go ahead and proceed with the project. However, if your project scope changes, then they will need to review those changes. So keep that in mind as you think about moving forward. If in your special conditions field you look and you see that additional information was requested about your project, then you need to get in contact with your project monitor, who will put you in contact with an MHT compliance team member who's the lead on your project. And in that case, you do not want to begin work on your project until the proposed work has been approved by MHT compliance. You also may have had a scenario listed at the bottom there where it's not that they need additional information, but the compliance team has listed conditions that you need to meet as you carry out your project. So if you have questions about those conditions, please talk with your project monitor, and if not, please comply with those conditions. If you go ahead with your project and ignore the conditions that were put forward there, and that will be in your grant agreement as well, then you do risk losing grant funds if you're not complying with those. And if the compliance team wants more information, this is the type of thing they would be requesting: maps, site plans, descriptions of work, drawings. Now it might be the case that you have a preservation easement with the Maryland Historical Trust on the building where you're doing work, or that the Maryland Historical Trust at MHAA has required you to convey a preservation easement, a new one, as one of the terms of your grant. And if that's the case, this is the area you need to keep in mind. So preservation easements are legal contracts between the property owner and the state of Maryland, and they protect against changes to that property that would be inconsistent with the historic preservation of the property. So if you have an easement on your building, then the state has the legal authority to enforce that easement through inspections, through review and approval of changes, and if the terms are not upheld, if you're making changes on the building that are not consistent with what the easement folks are requiring, then you may be required to reverse those changes or even subject to other penalties. So you do want to make sure you're staying in compliance with this, if that's the case. So the scenarios for easement review that you might find when you look in your special conditions field in your project summary sheet. One, you might have an existing MHT easement, and it might say in that field, easement review is required. So in that case, do not begin work on the project until the proposed work has been reviewed and approved by MHT, until you have that letter in hand from MHT that says the work's approved. Contact your project monitor and the easement staff to get started with the process of seeking review. If in your special conditions field it says that you're required to convey a new easement to MHT, that conveyance process can be a long process. So the first step we usually recommend is you treat it like you have an easement already in place, and you go ahead and seek approval of the work. So don't begin work on the project until it's been approved by the MHT easement staff and easement committee. But once you have that approval of the work, you can move forward with the work while you're still undergoing the conveyance process. Then when you get to close to the end of your project, you will need to have the easement fully conveyed before we can give you your final payment. So that'll be a requirement at that point. But I think the first step is just getting the work reviewed like that easement was already in place to make sure that's consistent with their standards. If you have nothing, if you have an easement on your property, but you have nothing listed in your special conditions field, then the work that you proposed in your application does not require easement review at this time. However, if your project scope changes, again, the easement folks would then at that point need to review those changes before you're able to move forward. And just to summarize, for both compliance review and easement review, if you're subject to these terms, we need to make sure that you find out what the requirements are now so that you don't have to make changes later. We would hate for you to move forward with something and then find out later that it wasn't approvable. So please get those approvals in place and don't risk any portion of your grant. And overall, I think this orientation in general, one of our main messages is that we want you to be in communication with us, either by email or phone or even a meeting. We want to be talking with you all and understanding how your projects are going. We're here to help, and we want to make your project as successful as possible. We want your grant experience to be this, just learning and doing a great job and safeguarding all the heritage of Maryland, and not this. We don't want you to be surprised and confused as you go along. We want you to feel like you can always reach out to us if you start to feel like this. So on that note, we have our contact information here. Jen Ruffner, the administrator of the program, myself, and Jen Neely, and we have our website there as well. So please feel free to reach out to any of us about questions that you have. We have our phone numbers and email addresses. And I'm also going to stay on the line here if you have other questions that you'd like to enter into the chat messages there. I think we addressed all the questions that came up as we went along. But if I'm wrong about that, please repaste your question in there so I can see it again. And yeah, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate you participating in this and appreciate your grants. And again, I think I'm going to stay on the line here until about 11:35. So if you have a question and you want to get it in, please type it there. But also feel free to contact us after via email or phone as well.